Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W and our continuing discussion of Vietnam. In the last few lectures, we've been talking about the early Cold War period, and in the last lecture, emphasizing policies like containment and the Marshall Plan. In this lecture, our final introductory lecture to the Cold War era, we're going to be talking about those policies being put into play in places like China and Korea, most visibly in the Korean War of the early 1950s. With the United States anchoring its policies in the years after the World War II on the idea of containment and containing communism anywhere around the world, something like the Civil War in China became a very complicated situation from the American perspective. This was an internal civil war. As I mentioned in a previous lecture, there were two sides, one led by the communist Mao Zedong, the other by the nationalist Chiang Kai-shek. And as I described, Harry Truman began sending support to Chiang Kai-shek. In 1948, Truman asked Congress for $570 million to send support to Chiang. He got about $400 million through Congress, which was enough to alienate Mao, but not enough to make Chiang happy. And as I mentioned, much of that money was siphoned off in corrupt schemes. Part of the problem in this situation was that the United States was interpreting the Chinese situation within the context of the American-Soviet Cold War. They didn't recognize the appeal of Mao himself to the people of China, and couldn't back off from support of Chiang and admit a mistake. In October of 1949, Mao was successful and established the People's Republic of China. Thus, the United States lost China, which would play a huge role in events to come in Korea, Vietnam, and elsewhere. Now, I've mentioned a few times already the idea of the domino theory. When it was applied to Vietnam itself, the thought was if Vietnam fell to communism, then so would Laos and Cambodia, Thailand, Burma, Japan, the Philippines, and eventually everywhere else. The State Department and American policymakers grew more concerned at the prospect of communism spreading in Asia in the late 1940s. This only worsened after the fall of China. Many assumed that China was the so-called first domino and that many other nations were on the brink of falling to communism as well. Policymakers envisioned two possibilities. These nations would be overtaken by communism directed from Moscow, or they would be run by communist governments not taking direct orders from Moscow, but following the same basic policies. Either scenario damaged the American vision of free trade in the region, as communism called for self-sufficiency and production to meet local needs. The United States sought to develop export production in the region. So even if Moscow was not directly involved, as in the case of Vietnam, the United States still had an interest in stopping the spread of communism. They had already lost China in 1949. They had to hold the line in Vietnam. And the effort took on added significance with the Korean War, which began in 1950. It felt like the war to stop communism had begun. As I've mentioned previously, in Vietnam itself, American intelligence indicated that without American assistance, France was in danger of being defeated by the Viet Minh. And so, in March of 1950, Truman approved $15 million spent specifically to aid French efforts in Indochina. This was the first time the Americans had offered direct support for the French colonial effort. It was no longer a secret. Unfortunately for the Americans, this was the beginning of a long losing effort. The war was already unpopular in France, and calls were beginning to abandon the war. Under the Truman administration, the United States sent military advisors, weapons, and aid totaling about $1 billion to the French in Indochina. If China was the first domino, and Vietnam was potentially the second, well, there were many other potential dominoes around the globe. One of the most obvious came to be Korea. This was another situation where it might have been seen as an independent situation, a nation trying to resolve its own issues internally. But the United States and its leaders could not view it that way. Everything was seen through the Cold War lens, the ideas of containment and NSC 68, which I discussed in the previous lecture. After World War II, Korea had been divided north and south, with the northern half under the influence of the Soviets and the southern half the influence of the Americans. As the ideology of containment began to heat up, Korea became an object of concern. We wanted to make sure that it too did not fall to communism. If you just look at the map of Korea there on the right, of course it is very near to China, with China overshadowing in particular North Korea. You might also note in the far northeast corner of that map the Soviet Union, which just touches on North Korea. And so this was seen as a very touchy situation and one that the Americans had to handle delicately. In 1950, Korea began to engage in a civil war. The North led by the communist Kim Il-sung and the South by Syngman Rhee. This is a similar situation to what we talked about in China itself. North Korea, according to this action, invaded South Korea. Now, historians now believe that the Civil War in Korea was just that it had very little to do with communism and the broader Cold War. But under the ideas of containment and in the atmosphere of that time, Truman and American leadership could only see the Korean conflict in Cold War terms. In other words, a victory by North Korea was a victory for communism. The Americans had to act quickly as North Korean forces threatened to take over the entire peninsula. The Americans and their South Korean allies were able to establish a perimeter around Pusan in the far southeast corner. They called an immediate meeting of the United Nations, which authorized forces to recover the effort in Korea. American forces, led by General Douglas MacArthur, launched a successful counterattack from Incheon. This was the second largest amphibious attack in history, second only to the D-Day invasion of Normandy. American forces then drove deep into North Korea, all the way up to the border with China. On November 8th, Americans bombed the bridges over the Yalu River, which bordered on China. And late in November, General MacArthur began to launch an offensive even north of the river. MacArthur had been misled to think that the Soviets and the Chinese would not intervene if he pushed this attack. In fact, though, 33 Chinese divisions smashed MacArthur and his troops. The Americans fled to the south, holding the line at the 38th parallel, roughly where the situation had started, in the middle of the country. By February of 1951, the situation was stable, and this became essentially a stalemate, with the two sides jockeying back and forth for several more years. In 1952, Dwight Eisenhower, the great World War II general, was elected president and said he would end the conflict. This was one of his campaign promises. In July of 1953, he helped to orchestrate an armistice, signing the armistice with a boundary at the 38th parallel, which was close to the initial line between North and South, and establishing a demilitarized zone between the two. And in fact, this armistice still remains in place even today. So how do we view what happened in Korea? Was it a success? Well, if the goal was to unify Korea and achieve outright victory, then it was a failure. If the goal was to limit the war and contain communism, then perhaps it might be viewed as a success. But with the way the war ended, and with many American forces being forced to retreat before those 33 Chinese divisions, it felt like a defeat. The bottom line was this was a civil war in Korea, unlikely tied to the Soviet Union in any direct way, that American leaders interpreted as a Cold War threat. It became evident that with the limitations of containment, it was going to be very difficult to win a war, and to gain ground. The objectives are not offensive, after all. They're defensive, to contain the enemy. So how do you end a conflict? Well, many of these same questions would plague the United States as they began to embark on the war in Vietnam. The costs of the Korean War were immense. There were some 4 million Koreans killed, roughly a million Chinese, about 52,000 Americans killed, and a cost of $20 billion. The Korean War also had deep and prolonged impact, overshadowing many other events of the early 1950s. As I mentioned, it seemed that the United States had prevented the South Korean domino from falling, and thus it became easier to defend containment and efforts in places like Indochina, which we will of course be talking much more about in future lectures. The Korean War also aided Eisenhower in his rise to power. He had campaigned in 1952 on a platform to end the war in Korea, and then did just that soon after becoming president. And so it secured his status as the president. It also contributed to a deterioration in U.S.-Chinese relations, Sino-U.S. relations. We were, after all, at war against the Chinese. It also pushed the American Army to continue growing. This is all still within the context of NSC 68 and fell in line with the idea that we needed to continue this process of militarization. During the war, we were experimenting with tactical nuclear weapons, continuing the push for the hydrogen bomb, which was developed in 1952, and continuing to prove other weapons like bombers, planes, and Korea was the first major military engagement of the Cold War. There would be many others. And this was a sign of things to come. American policy was almost paranoid of communist expansion. They also showed an inability to distinguish between civil war and internal conflicts and those threatening Soviet involvement. This would become very evident as well in Vietnam. It was difficult to win a clear victory under containment, and the threat of nuclear war would continue to become greater and greater as the military buildup continued. I would also note that in Korea, the end of the war was an armistice rather than a formal peace treaty. Both sides laid down their weapons and the lines were drawn, but at any time the conflict could flare up again, and that continues even to this day. After the Korean War, the United States began to see how the Cold War would play out. This was a situation where there would be neither peace nor outright war with the Soviets, but we must be prepared for what might erupt at any moment. As we saw in Korea, the North Koreans came very close to winning the war just within its first few days. And so after the Korean War, the United States believed it must always be on a perpetual wartime budget. It must always be prepared for whatever might come. Even as the Korean War was ongoing, it began to have an impact on the French Indochina situation. Late in 1951, the United States sent a massive shipment of supplies to the French army in Indochina. 130,000 tons of equipment, 53 million rounds of ammunition, 200 aircraft, 650 vehicles, and 14,000 automatic weapons. As I've mentioned previously, many of these supplies would eventually be stolen or seized by the Viet Minh and used against the French, and later even used against the Americans. It's in 1952 that Dwight Eisenhower, the great former World War II general, was elected. He was hugely popular, smiling and likable after the seemingly cold and calculating Truman. Eisenhower was known to bumble through press conferences and wander aimlessly in answering questions, but most historians agree that he was much shrewder than he let on. In one briefing session for a press conference, he told officials, "Don't worry. If that question comes up, I'll just confuse them." Eisenhower was subtler than Truman, but had a way of coaxing people to his side. "You don't lead by hitting people over the head," he once said. Any damn fool can do that, but it's usually called assault, not leadership. Eisenhower didn't particularly like the arms race, although by necessity he continued to insist on the building of more and more weapons. He was more in favor of intelligence and technology. The CIA really came into its own during his presidency, planting spies and agents in other nations to influence policy. He believed in more bang for the buck, with nuclear weapons and air power as the emphasis rather than traditional ground forces. His Secretary of State was John Foster Dulles, a very strong anti-communist. It became almost a biblical crusade for him. Together, Dulles and Eisenhower forged a foreign policy they called the New Look. This policy was anchored on several ideas. First of all, as I've mentioned, the emphasis on nuclear weapons and air power, this idea of more bang for the buck. They also emphasized the possibility of massive retaliation, the threat of using nuclear weapons, even in diffusing small situations. This leads to the idea of mutually assured destruction, MAD. It is at some point here in the early to mid-50s when World War III begins to look like the end of the world, and thus, if either nation ever pushed the button, so to speak, it would lead to the end of humanity. And finally, it is under Eisenhower and Dulles that we really began talking about the domino theory. If one nation fell to communism, then the next, and eventually they would all fall. Eisenhower and Dulles didn't immediately change much in the Indochina policy left to them by Truman. They remained committed to stopping the spread of communism in Southeast Asia, and remained concerned that a communist government there would weaken the chances of Japan's full economic recovery and the rest of the region. So they continued to provide aid to the French, even while concerned that the war effort was not going well. By the end of 1952, the number of killed, wounded, missing, or captured for the French was more than 90,000, and anti-war sentiment in France was growing. The Korean War armistice, reached in July 1953, was also cause for concern. There was the possibility that China might now get involved in Indochina, as its troops were no longer committed to Korea. The United States also warned that they might use atomic weapons against China if it intervened. The Korea situation also strengthened the anti-war effort in France itself. If the United States had settled for a stalemate in Korea, why couldn't the French do the same in Vietnam? It appeared that the French were nearing an end of their efforts in Indochina. As I described in previous lectures, they sought one last offensive to improve their position before arriving at that peace. This was the period of the Dien Bien Phu siege and the attack that followed. The United States contemplated supporting Navarre in his efforts in 1953 and contemplated Operation Vulture and sending aid to relieve the French at Dien Bien Phu. But Navarre did not succeed. Dien Bien Phu proved to be a disastrous defeat for the French, and now the United States had to confront the issue of what they were going to do next. And thus we have come full circle. We've arrived back at the end of the Battle of Dien Bien Phu and looking toward the Geneva Accords. Hopefully this gives you some background in America's thinking in this period and why and how they chose to step in and assume the role that France had held in Vietnam prior to this period. In the lectures to come, we will now address America's direct involvement in what would become the Vietnam War.